Everybody take your seats. We are going to get started. Hopefully you made it to the right room. It's okay if you didn't. There's no shame in getting up and walking backwards, like the TSA lines that we're all familiar with. My name is Cameron Jenkins, and I'm the Managing Director for Mainframe Modernization Group here at Accenture, working in Jeff Emerson's team, and we have a band of other folks that you've probably had a chance to meet during this session, or this event. We are going to be talking about mainframe modernization at Rowe Price with Gen AI, of course. We are very, very lucky to have a esteemed longtime customer of ours, Sri Kandathai, who's here from Rowe Price. Thank you very much, Sri, for being here. It's a great pleasure to have you. I know how busy you are, especially with our project, right? And you're going to hear a lot from Sri, not so much from myself, a little bit from Joel as well. But Sri's got a very esteemed background. Not only has he been at Rowe Price for about a year, and he is the executive sponsor for the project that we're working on with Rowe. So I have the pleasure of working with him sometimes daily. I don't know if he'd say the same, though. We'll find out. But so it's a really, really important project for the company, as you're going to come to hear, in case it's not obvious already. And his background includes working at CoreLogic, and most notably at Experian. We've had some long discussions about this, where he had great success in a modernization project there. So this is in no way Sri's first rodeo, very American statement, nor is it mine, right? So it's great that we're working with somebody inside a customer that's got that kind of background. I'm also joined on stage by my colleague, Mr. Joel Rosenberger, also from Accenture, Mainframe Modernization Chief Architect Extraordinaire. I added the extraordinaire part. So glad that he's here. And he's in the AABG group. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure everybody does. It's the Amazon, Accenture. Maybe we should switch those, but we're at Amazon's event. I'll call it the Amazon Accenture Business Group. And one of the most notable things that Joel has done, and there are many, and there's reasons for him to be on this stage as well, is he's helped strengthen the partnership between Amazon and Accenture, and was the architect and the implementer of the Go Big program. And I'll let, he might not talk about it today, but if you don't know about it, you see him after the show, so to speak, right? But it is, I should not joke, it's a huge, huge strategic venture for our two companies, and it's been put in place to help customers like Rowe Price and others. So really thrilled to be part of that, and thrilled that we've got the mastermind behind that. So, and now, I must say, I think between Joel and myself, and there's a few other in the audience, right? We're probably collectively the oldest folks in the mainframe modernization space, at least in Vegas, maybe California, maybe Nevada, I'm not sure, in the United States. We've been getting a lot of old jokes, but that's okay, because it also hopefully comes with the recognition of our wisdom and our experience that we can help bring to key projects like this, right? This is, my wife always says, why do you keep doing this? I said, it's all I know and it's all I love. I have a passion for it. I love working with people like, specifically Sri, in these organizations, right? And to help them, fulfill their target goals. So the last thing I'm going to say before I turn it over to our real speaker is, isn't it interesting, everybody? Like 1 year ago, did we all think we were going to be here talking about Gen AI almost in every, specifically in every session, not just at this event, but other events like it around the globe. And within the Mainframe Modernization Group, the hope that you could take all that legacy code, and yes, where's Jeff? I'm going to talk about assembler. But COBOL, assembler, PO1, and all the applications written in it over the years and years and years. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about here. And feed it through a Gen AI engine, and out pops beautiful Java or some other programming language of your choice. And we wish that that's the case, right? But we're not there yet, right? That's not the state of the market. We're getting there, but it's not the state of the market. Deterministic, tools that have been around doing refactoring, rehosting, and other such patterns still rule the day, right? They've seen billions of lines of code parsed and through their converters, and it's that accumulated knowledge that comes from doing that, right? Not just the code part, but all the business elements, the workflows that come with that, from the business analysts who have to work side by side with the technicians who are doing the code conversion. That's built into those patterns. And we'll get there with Gen AI. The good news is Gen AI is doing a lot of assisting in that area, in the areas of reverse engineering and testing. And that's my segue for Sri, because that's how we're using Gen AI, at least initially, inside Rowe Price. So it's my distinct and great pleasure to introduce you to Sri, who will take us through. Thank you, Sri.
Thank you, Cameron.
Yeah.
Well, great to be here. Hope everybody is having fun at the reInvent. Who is following all the new services that has been announced yesterday? Hope you got to. Well, the one that I'm excited about is S3 support for Apache Iceberg. Learning a lot about it. It's very interesting. So happy to be here and talk through, essentially our sort of approach to the mainframe exit, why it is important, and share some of the insights in terms of why we are doing this, and then the partnership with AWS and Accenture in making this happen. It's one of the strategic important goals for T. Rowe Price to essentially exit mainframe and then continue our journey in the distributed world. Little bit background about T. Rowe Price. Those of you who don't know T. Rowe Price, we are an asset management company founded in 1937. We have about $1.6 trillion, $1.61 trillion assets under management, typically how these asset management companies are classified in terms of their size of the portfolio. We support multitude of different products, just to name a few: retirement products, 529 education plans, and many others. So we are a financial services company. We help customers in making successful in their financial journey and in their personal investment to make sure that when they retire, they can carry forward with their financial freedom. And with that, let me proceed. Why modernization? So the real remit of why we are doing mainframe modernization is the culmination of two different capabilities or two different strategies coming together. The first one is advancing our cloud strategy, where how do we reduce the total cost of operation, but more importantly, how do we innovate at the pace of the market, where we can have applications at the target environment, where we can scale to the market condition, we can improve the capabilities where we can truly deliver to the market needs and demands, and we are not constrained by the legacy capabilities and the legacy footprint in terms of the scale, and how do we want to invest in the legacy technology, but more on the modern technology that will give us the right fit in terms of how do we deliver new products and capabilities to the market and our customers. The second part is culmination of data strategy that is embedded within the cloud strategy, where how do we share data with our partners and ecosystems, and then how do we sort of bring the data, one of the constructs we are working on is the data lakehouse. How do we bring the data where we can centrally govern the data and also have an aspect of organizing the data centrally, but democratizing the access to the data in terms of distribution patterns such as Snowflake shares, or whether it is distributing to our internal partners, which is frictionless through an internal data marketplace. So a lot of these strategies are for us important, and that's the reason why we are executing this mainframe exit project, so that we can advance both cloud strategy as well as data strategy, so that we can move forward on the capabilities that we want to bring to bear for the market demands and the needs. In terms of the current challenges, as many of you know, the key need and driver is how do we reduce time to market in terms of delivering to the market conditions and needs, because the market is already constantly changing. How do we adapt? How do we make it much more agile? And to get that agility, we need to have capabilities both from infrastructure as well as from the application to support those needs. Then how do we reduce the risk, but at the same time increase the business agility to meet the market demands? These are some of the challenges that anyone could have in a legacy technology where it doesn't scale to the needs of the business that we want to have. Especially, vertical scaling is a challenge in the legacy technology capabilities. We want to have a true horizontal scaling, And that's the reason why we are executing this strategic initiative. In terms of technology, as I said earlier, the culmination of cloud strategy and data strategy is the key driver for us to execute these capabilities. And then, as you know, from a resource point of view, the needs of resources on supporting legacy technology is becoming scarce over the years, and it is hard to get the resources. People coming out of college, they don't know what COBOL is. They don't know what mainframe is, right? So it's becoming very scarce. So it adds a lot of risk to the business if we want to continue and maintain the legacy application. And that's another demand and the market driver that we want to get this done. And most importantly, we want to scale for capabilities such as any type of Gen AI or innovations that we want to apply to the target state and then take our capability to the next level so that we can compete in the market. And in order to do that, we have to get out of the legacy system and then be in the distributed system as well as cloud native so that we can provide these capabilities at scale. Where we started, in terms of the footprint, these are some of the sort of the relative numbers. The total compute is about 2,300 MIPS, which is equivalent to the CPU that you can measure on the open systems. We have about 57 applications roughly that we have on the mainframe asset, and then 1 million lines of code, which is JCL, and about 65K of COBOL lines of code, and then about 56 screens, which we call it as BMS screens. Predominantly, these are CACS screens, which is the UI capability on the mainframe. And then there are about 44 visual agent screens that we have as an asset. In total, we have run about 2,000 odd batch jobs, and we have about 436 SaaS programs, which we started very early, and then there are about 7,000 reports. So this is some metrics around what we have on the mainframe footprint in terms of what we want. And from a data size, predominantly our data store is DB2. We have about 1 terabytes of data, and then we have about 5 terabytes of various data stores, including vSAM, which is predominantly the data stores that you can have on the mainframe asset. Then there is also capabilities where we have integration with the distributed systems. So we use Informatica for our legacy ETL. There are about 3,000 workloads that happens that brings data from our data suppliers and then loads the data into the legacy mainframe asset. And then there are about 844 DB2 ZOS call that happens in Java, where the Java applications connect to the mainframe, and then they get the data in terms of the services. And we also have FTP footprint, which is NDM and SFTP. So NDM is typically your direct connect that access data to the mainframe using SNA protocol. And SFTP is your secure FTP that does the data exchange. So this is kind of a landscape of what our mainframe footprint is on what we are transforming. In terms of where we want to go from the footprint that we have, we are converting with the capabilities that Accenture is bringing to bear for us, converting the 650K of lines of code that we have in COBOL to Java. And that will give us a good landing spot in terms of taking and further advancing and modernizing our applications. The remaining sort of the footprint, such as the JCL, we are converting them into Python code. Then the CA7, which is the scheduler on the mainframe, we are converting that into Autosys. Then the SAS program are converted into Java. Then we are going to have 2 databases. One is RDS DB2 on AWS. It's a relatively new service that is available within AWS. So we are going to convert DB2 on ZOS into DB2 RDS on the target state in Amazon environment. And then the vSAM files will be converted into SQLite. In terms of the ETL jobs, on the workloads, we will support both DB2 RDS, as well as we have PostgreSQL, Aurora Postgres, that we use. So we'll be landing some of the data into Aurora Postgres. The reason we have two databases, today there are some applications where we have tight coupling within the DB2 data store. So from the point of easiness, we are going to take those tight coupled applications and then land them into DB2 RDS. Whereas where we have some flexibility in terms of the applications, where we have the choice, we're going to land them into Aurora PostgreSQL. So that's kind of the distinction between the two on why we choose two databases. A lot of the ZOS calls that we have, we're going to remediate them into calls that are in Java. And then a lot of the FTP, traditional FTP that we have in the mainframe, we'll make them as AWS native. So essentially, this is the sort of the reference deployment architecture, where we will have the applications, and then we will deploy them that is supported in two zones, so that there will be active-active or active-passive type configuration we can have in terms of making it highly resilient, switching from the legacy to AWS environment. So this will give us a good starting point in terms of supporting the resiliency, agility, scalability, and also having a good backup and recovery in terms of having two regions that can be supported, or two zones that can be supported in the deployment model. All right, talking about the methodology, there are three phases. One is discovery, architecture design, and execution and deployment. In terms of the discovery, we use GenAI essentially on 4 different aspects. One is the reverse engineering. A lot of the code that we have has been in operational for many years. In some cases, we may have very minimal number of resources supporting it. So this is where I think GenAI will excel, where we can do the discovery of how the application works, and then essentially taking that capability and then converting that into Java, so that we have a good business logic that we can deliver in Java and then continue to modernize. The other important aspect is, with GenAI, is test data generation. And this is an important aspect as well as a risk on the legacy technology, where if your test cases and test suite is not maintained and you have applications that's been running for a long time, GenAI really excels in this area, where how do we generate the test data, supplemented with the test scripts and the automation that can go along with it, and how do we sort of bring that together where we don't have to worry about who understands the application, but use the capability to drive what the business logic is about, and then generate the appropriate test data that can be a good augmentation on what you don't have, and reducing the risk from the not having a good support on the legacy technology. So this is where I think we had reasonable sort of approach and measured success in terms of using the GenAI capability. In terms of the architecture and design, we have our infrastructure stood up in AWS, and we will have all the necessary ingredients on the resiliency and scalability, and typically having a good integration with our distributed application, and more importantly, the standard monitoring and governance that we have for any cloud environment. Now, these applications can also benefit from the same cloud strategy that we support for all other applications, so that there is standardization of the monitoring capability, there is standardization of how do you measure resiliency and how do you scale your application. There is that consistency of approach that we apply it to all cloud application, including the applications that are converted from the mainframe. So everything kind of converges into one nice ecosystem that we can use as a standard practice. Finally, on the execution and deployment, we are planning to deploy, and we have one wave that we have completed. We have 2 remaining waves that we are planning to complete in 2025. And then each wave, at the end of each wave, we will have a hypercare that is supported by Accenture in terms of how we want to manage these deployment of these applications. There are multiple patterns that are out there. Each company has to decide, what pattern is right for them. For example, you could have a pattern where you want to move all of your reads into distributed applications so that if you are read heavy, you can service that in the distributed application and then keep the writes so that you have a single source of truth in DB2, and then you can eventually move that. There are patterns where if the applications are intertwined, where you have equal number of reads and writes for the application, and if it is difficult to separate them out, then you move that intertwined application as target state so that you can bring both reads and writes for that application. So in our case, we have 3 waves, and we have a mixture of applications that can be independently moved. We also have applications where there is a intertwining of the reads and writes so that we have to move them together in the target state. So depending upon what the footprint is, organizations can select what is appropriate for them. All right. This is an approach on the modernization methodology. So I'm going to ask Joel to speak to this.
Sure. Happy to talk to this. Thanks, Sri. So thanks, everybody. First, a lot of boxes. I'll promise you I won't talk about every single box, or we'll be here for hours, and the people in the back will be mad at me from that. But what I wanted to do, and I guess we need an architect up here to talk about this from that.
A chief architect.
A chief architect, cool. So that means I know all the boxes then.
Right.
But one of the things that I wanted to talk about is, I think you mentioned it at the beginning, Cameron, about, we would love to have the ability to just hit a button and have this all work. But it doesn't work that way. So one of the things what we've described or we've created at Accenture is really a methodology about how do you approach these things. I remember really early on, Sri, one of the things we asked was, hey, by the way, are there any applications outside the mainframe that connect to that data?
Yes.
No, maybe. Oh, now we find out there's 844,000 Java calls into the mainframe. So that's kind of interesting. So one of the things we want to look at is we use this approach to be able to actually figure out how do we do that discovery? How do we actually go in and dive in? And then how do we figure out, what's equivalent? How do we do that? And so if you take a look at this, one of the things that I want to make sure that when I talk to all the clients and people going through this journey is don't just focus on the tools. Tools are important. Don't get me wrong. Tools are very important. But if it's just the tool and you can't hit that button and make it happen, you need a methodology to make this happen. And so that's really what this is about. How do we take a look at the discovery? How do we look at, what's DB2? Like, I know another thing that happened is we found, oh, by the way, here are 6 different modules, or I don't know the exact number, but here's a number of modules that we don't have source code for. What do? Are they critical? Are they not critical? Well, using our methodology, as we did a discovery, what we found is, you mentioned visual age early on. How many people remember visual age? Yeah, there's a few of us. What we found is there was a distributed version of visual age that the source code actually happened not to reside on the mainframe, resided off the mainframe, and it was imported into the mainframe, the actual executables. So when you think about that and you think about, hey, how do I tackle this problem? it's more complex than, hey, let me just feed some code, if I have the code, into a tool, push a button, and everything's working. So that's kind of the discovery part that I talked about, and that's really kind of the upper left-hand quadrant there of what do we do? How do we figure out this? How do we figure out what's your security posture? What's RACF look like? And all that. So that's a methodology we go through to be able to figure all those things out. And then on the right-hand side, it's really about, how do we test this? Because one of the things, you're talking about patterns.
Yep.
If we're doing a refactor pattern, if we're doing a replatform pattern, or we're doing anything like that, well, we need to do functional equivalency. How do we make sure that what we just created, be it in COBOL to COBOL, or COBOL to Java, or COBOL to .NET, or whatever we do, how do we make sure it's doing the same thing? Because I don't know about you, if I was getting my financial statement, and well, I might be happy if the zero's in the right place, an extra 1 or 2,
yeah.
But you wouldn't be happy. We just want to make sure that that all happens. And how do we do that? And then let me ask another question. With the mainframe, we always have a robust test environment, don't we? We have test cases that measure every different use case you can have. I can tell you I can't think of one mainframe engagement I've done that they've had a robust one. They've usually had a few here and there. Yep. Most of them have 0. And what's the testing? Oh, well, I just go tell my users to try it and file a ticket if it doesn't work. And from there. So one of the things that we do is we really go through a methodology about how do we set this up and how do we make sure that we have equivalency? How do we make sure it's performant? Because how many times, I know I was working on one project where they had sub-second response time on the mainframe. Well, when we left all the data on the mainframe and tried to do it remotely and from that, take a guess what my transaction time was. It was 19 seconds. Think about this, and let's say I did 3 or 4 transactions on that, and it was a web page. Will you sit on a web page and wait for 35 seconds for that web page to refresh? You won't wait for that, especially if you're used to sub-second response time from that. So a lot of things, when we think about this framework, those are the measurements, those are the KPIs, the SLAs we want to really focus on to make sure that happens from there. And then when you really think about this whole picture, it's not Accenture doing this, it's not T-Rowe doing this, it's not AWS doing this. It's a partnership. It's about all of us doing it together. Because at the end of the day, we don't know exactly what your applications do. Yep. So for user acceptance testing, we need your help. For an AWS environment, talking about the latest service, who's the best people to do that? Maybe AWS, working with AWS to do that. There's a number of things. We have this methodology to really bring that together and about the RACI, about different things. So it's really, I want to leave a thought that it's complex, but we've done this a number of times, and it's a real partnership about bringing all 3 parties together and making it happen from there. So that's what I'm excited about. And that's what I think the journey we're on together. So just want to talk about a little bit on methodology. So back to you, Sri.
So essentially, in terms of the usage of Gen AI, what we talked about is really, if you look at it, it's the culmination of the things from a discovery point of view. As Joel talked about, the ability to understand what the business logic is in the legacy footprint is a risk proposition because you may not have the resource to sort of support and understand what it is. And that's where I think the usage of Gen AI comes in very, very helpful and handy from a productivity measure because now you can use this discovery capability to scale across the application in terms of understanding what the business logic is. And from there, how do we drive test data and test data generation supported by the automation so that we can have a good plan on testing. Testing is one of the critical areas in the legacy mainframe modernization because you would want to have functional equivalence between the source and the target. So Gen AI capability usage is really key measure of success in utilizing it. In terms of understanding the data footprint on the legacy side and using Gen AI, we can create a good data dictionary in terms of understanding what the taxonomy is on the data and how do we sort of equivalent and equate that into a good business definition is also a key measure of success. Because a lot of the data model that has been defined on the mainframe side, as there were space constraints, there were many things. You could see like 1, 2, 3, or usage of A and sort of symbolic type coding that has been done for the column names. We don't have that constraint anymore. And certainly we don't have that constraint on the distributed side or on the modern cloud architecture. But how do you map that into a good taxonomy where you can land in a place and continue a true business definition? That's where we can use Gen AI capability. Yep. So just want to highlight some of these key areas where how do we define this? And that's where if you look at on the left-hand side, a lot of these copybooks provide those definitions in terms of what the data structure is. Now you can take that data structure, translate that into the modern data taxonomy that you can define in the target state. Whether it is Aurora Postgres or DB2 RDS, you can define that with the taxonomy that you want to have. So when you compare the testing, now you can compare the test between the source and targets, taking into account the redefined taxonomy. So this is just kind of like a high-level timeline of how we approached the mainframe modernization. Our quest for mainframe modernization started in 2022, where the initiative started, and then it was sort of harmonization of how do we bring the priority across the different business units and the risks that we have, and how do we sort of bring that together, a common business case that we can stand behind and then continue, make sure that everybody is behind it and supportive of it. So from there, our journey started in 2023, where we started the discovery and initial sort of design and analysis phase. And then in 2024, we started the initiative. We completed one of the waves, and we are going to continue in 2025 with our remaining waves, so that at the end of 2025, for us is to take this into further modernization, where we can continue to use Gen AI capabilities in further advancing our capabilities, whether it is application modernization or increasing developer productivity or bringing additional productivity measures using Gen AI. The options are many for us to choose. So that's kind of like a high-level timeline of how we are approaching. Certainly, this is a strategic initiative for us, and it's one of the important goals for us that we are executing on. So with that, I think we are at Q&A session. I will turn it over to Cameron.
Okay. So if we have time, we'll open it up for any audience questions. But I actually, surprise, did an impromptu poll of a lot of registrants ahead of time, some people in the line as well that were coming in to get their questions. And I just wanted to, just like a millennial, I'm going to read them from my phone, right? Seen the newscasters, they just do this. So I guess that's okay to do. But anyway, Sri, I just wanted to, the first one that came through, and this was like the most common one is, well, and you touched on it a little bit, but maybe you can expand on it. What are the primary business drivers behind Rowe Price's decision to modernize its mainframe, or I guess mainframe exit?
Yeah, essentially it's a culmination of the cloud strategy and data strategy that is driving the mainframe modernization. With any legacy technology and legacy footprint, scaling becomes difficult in terms of how you can be very agile in supporting the business demands. With mainframe, you have the aspect of vertical scaling, then you can expand, buying additional engines and things like that. So there is a sort of a total cost of ownership that comes into play. So from that point of view, how do we set up success from having the applications where we can reduce the risk for all the factors that we talked about, land in a cloud environment like AWS, and continue to innovate and scale and build upon capabilities, because end of the day, we want to have an environment where we can build business applications that are truly driving market needs and demands. And we want to be very agile to that. And that's the reason it's very important for us to do that, coupled with our data strategy in terms of how do we take the data that we have within the mainframe asset, where we can govern centrally, we can organize data in a much effective way, and the business taxonomy is one thing that we talked about. How do we make sure that we have right representation of the business taxonomy? And most importantly, democratization of data access. How do we enable that in the modern cloud environment is a key measure of success for us.
Indeed.
Because end of the day, with legacy technologies, you will have a lot of constraints in terms of how you share data, whether it is internal partners or external. Taking that challenge and then flipping it on its head, where we want to give capabilities to our internal partners and external customers, where data, sharing of data or sharing the decision is frictionless and easily available. And the primary goal from the data strategy is how do we democratize the access from where we have a nice catalog capability on the modern distributed system that we can integrate, taking the legacy assets and then putting it into a good place where it's easily accessible.
Tremendous. Great detailed answer. You can tell he's done this before. This next question, and I've been personally involved in this one with you, Sri, but I'm sure a lot of people, especially with Gen AI being still in its infancy to some degree, maybe a toddler by now. What internal security issues did you have installing Gen AI inside T. Rowe Price? And certainly as a wealth management company, to Joel's joke earlier about the zeros, right? I mean, it's funny on one side, but on the other side, it's a go out of business strategy, right? So what did you face, and how did you overcome that inside T. Rowe?
I think, with any new capabilities, one of the things that has to be looked at from a risk perspective, who's governing the data in terms of what Gen AI produces, and what are sort of the security sort of wrapper and controls we have in governing the Gen AI data, right? That is going to be the key decisioning factor for any financial services company, including T. Rowe Price. So that is one of the key anchoring consideration for us.
Great. We had talked about internal challenges. I know we will move past that. So are you planning, I think I saw it on your slide, but maybe you can expand on it. Are you planning to rewrite or reimagine, which of course is the new emerging term that people are using for automated rewriting, these applications after exiting the mainframe in December 2025? What's that plan?
Actually, all the above.
All the above.
It's interesting where we actually are targeting about a dozen applications where even before we are migrating to the distributed, we are sunsetting them. And then once we have the application on the target state in the cloud environment, it gives a lot of flexibility to the app owners as well as the business owners on how they want to take it forward. And that is the beauty of this migration, where it gives that flexibility and agility. Because when you have multitude of business owners who are managing this application, each one of the business application will have its own sort of needs on what needs to be done. Some of them will have capabilities where I want to take it and further modernize. For example, if we convert that into Java, we may want to build microservices on top of that, and then get that to scale. That could be one avenue for a business application. Or somebody can say, well, I am not ready to retire this application because I want to take this next 3 years and then run it to end of life, right? Or in some cases, it could be somewhere in the middle where I want to, take incremental steps as MVP in terms of modernization. So the answer is not one pattern. You could have multiple patterns across the enterprise with the complexity. And the beauty is it gives that flexibility back to the business owners and application to use what is needed for them truly to take the next step. So the answer is all the above.
All the above. And here's an interesting one, and this is something I certainly have been asked and asked the question myself over the years of having done this, but inside T. Rowe Price, is the entire organization, I think the person asking the question meant, at what level in the organization do you have support for this effort, right? Because you and I have talked before, Sri, where 10, 15 years ago, didn't have that CIO or presidential support, and some of those projects kind of got off the rails. What is the support that you've got from your senior leadership?
We have support for this initiative at the highest level. Our CEO is supportive of it, our CTO is supportive of it, and our COO is supportive of it, our CDO is supportive of it. So definitely across the C-suite, they stand behind this initiative. And having that level of support and mandate helps us to drive the outcome in terms of what we want to achieve in terms of modernization. But it is also the other perspective, right? Which is kind of reducing the business risk that is always comes with the legacy technology. And that's also an angle that drives into the overall decision making.
Gotcha. Right. Joel, you have a comment?
Yeah, I think that's really important because one thing you didn't say there is this is cheaper. Why is that important? Because if the only reason you're doing mainframe modernization is to drive down cost, I think that's what you were kind of getting to is the ways that people have been doing this in the past is, I can save a ton of money. It's a benefit.
Yeah.
It's definitely a benefit, don't get me wrong about that. But if you don't have a strategic view of how I'm getting off the mainframe and why I'm getting off the mainframe, you'll run into problems, just to be honest, and from there. So that's why it was so exciting then when we first started working with Sri, is basically you have that support at the highest level. So it's not just, hey, let's save some money. It's a strategic move for T. Rowe Price to get off the mainframe and really start doing this modernization of the applications and enhancing the business and making technology a technical strength and not necessarily just a cost play.
Absolutely.
And of course, this question came through, and because of where we are, I have to ask it, but why AWS for cloud? Careful. Careful. Maybe we should go to the next question. Next question is why Accenture.
Well, AWS is a natural partner for T. Rowe Price. When we started the cloud journey that precedes my time many years ago, I think it's a natural inclination to work with AWS, be it proximity, to where we are, close to Baltimore, and where AWS office is in Virginia. That may be one factor, but just kidding aside, I think, AWS is a leader in cloud space. Certainly, embracing that leadership that AWS brings to the table is natural for us to choose AWS as a partner.
Fantastic. Do I dare ask why Accenture, Sri, or should I move on? I'll walk out of the room. No, you don't have to answer that one. That's okay. The last question that I have, and then we can open up if anybody's got a question that we can answer, that's fine. I don't know if we have a microphone for the audience. Maybe we can prepare that while I'm doing this last question. I think we know the answer to this, but the writer says, Do you still believe that testing is the most difficult and important aspect of a mainframe modernization project, right? I think that might be self-evident, but go ahead and espouse on that, please.
Testing is one of the key aspects on the migration, and certainly it's one of the most important one. Why? Because it is sort of building the confidence on people in terms of, people are a little bit nervous because these applications has been running for a long time. When you cut this over, testing is an important component that sort of cements the confidence that, yes, I see the same sort of business outcomes between the source to target, and I will get what I wanted in the target state. So it's essentially building that confidence level with the business partners and stakeholders, including the app owners. And getting testing right is an important milestone that any legacy modernization, including the mainframe modernization, needs to have.
Right.
And that's why the usage of Gen AI, where if the test suite or if the test data has not been kept up to the times, or if you don't have the resources to support it, how do you sort of de-risk that in using Gen AI capabilities from discovery and generating the data and using that to augment and mitigate all the risk is important.
Well said, Sri. Great questions, great answers, Sri and Joel. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody's attention. I know we're a little bit over. I'm going to get the cane here pretty soon. So, but listen, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Sri's name, my name's up there. If you need Joel, come to me. Thank you.